is the Russian character in foreign policy characterized purely by an extremist militarism in a way?
I think there's definitely elements to it. I think as with pretty much anything, it's hard to sort of fully reject it, but it's also hard to fully accept that. I think if we look at evidence from the past, I think there's, especially sort of with the Tsars, I think there's evidence of it, and I mean with Putin today again, I think there is evidence for it as well. What are your views on it?
I think something that we talked about in previous conversations before, which has been really, really insightful, is the fact that Russia has like a great man, big man theory behind its national ethos. The idea of like this ultra-masculine conqueror in a way. And a key figure which I think is quite poignant in that is probably Tsar Peter the Great.
Yes. If anything, you could make a decent argument for him being the one that birthed that idea, being I mean, just he was an anomaly physically of Russians at the time. You know, they were not a tall race, and yet he was 6'8", which would have been totally alien to anyone who outside of St. Petersburg.
It's alien today, isn't it?
Exactly. I mean, it would have been probably terrifying for a lot of people to see a man like that in such elaborate dress walking towards them, and it's easy then to understand how this kind of came about, in that people would have seen that, and I mean, today we have explanations for it. We know it came from the Germanic blood, or the Germanic part of the family. But for them then, the easiest explanation would have been that he is closer to God, and that he is like a godlike figure in a way. So it's easy to understand why that's come about. And I mean, you could make a good argument for Putin, sort of strengthening that today, in that I think it's very clear the image that he has always tried to sow, the videos of him wandering the forests on a horse with his shirt off and spear fishing. Like it's the idea over there that would be so appetizing to the public. Whereas over here, if we saw a video of Keir Starmer riding through the forest with his shirt off, he'd just get mocked for it. So yeah, I think this great man idea, I think it's something that's definitely still being perpetuated today by Putin.
Do you think so? Do you think it's able to be carried over from a place of religious sentiment to a place of non-religious sentiment with the Soviet Union and the atheism that comes with that Marxist thinking?
I think when you bring religion into it, I think Russia has been a place that has always, as with everyone else, has been a hive of religious activity. I mean, obviously we had a lot of cultist activity in the early 20th century that Russia was very well known for. Obviously there was the background of Rasputin and the activities that he was getting up to in Siberia. But I mean, if you look at how this communists tried to repress that religious identity, I mean, they tried to. It's almost as if they lent into this big man theory, this idea of the perfect idol theory, and they wanted their leaders instead to be the god instead. Like Stalin was obviously with the cult of personality, was obviously that great man in the Communist Party. It's why he lasted for so long. I mean, he obviously when Barbarossa happened, he retreated to his dacha, thinking that it all was over. And when they came to bring him back to Moscow, they thought they were there to kill him. But the way that he'd created this cult of personality, this idea that he was the big man in the Communist Party, to an extent, it saved his life. While you can say that the communists tried to repress religious thinking and religious activity in Russia, I think the themes are still there, and the key sort of ideas are still there, even if the religion maybe wasn't as prominent.
Going back to Stalin, I think that one thing that really grabs me is that cult of personality mixed with the fear. I think what you touched on there was quite interesting, in the fact of the fear. You mentioned it saved his life. Is there any instance where it could have been a huge threat to his life? Maybe the purges?
You could have made the argument there, yeah. So I think the purges were maybe when he came closest to being unseated, but then in a way, did the fear, were the purges a way that he was able to, in a way, illustrate the power that he had over the party, of the things that he carried out, and yet he didn't face a massively significant threat. I think that there were times where I think he faced threats, but I think a lot of that came in the early years of the Communist Party, maybe just during or after the Civil War. I think was probably when he would have felt most unsafe, although he was paranoid for pretty much the whole time he was in power.
So we're talking about the region of 1924 here.
Yeah, around that. I think that would have been the closest that he actually came to being unseated, or actually sort of facing something where he would have lost power in the party. But the paranoia of that stayed with him all the way through. That's why you see things like the purges. That's why, I mean, at the end, you could make the argument that he almost caused his own death, in that the doctors' conspiracy of, the Jewish doctors were out to get him, and then obviously there was no one left to save him. I think there's a really great example there of the fact that although maybe he didn't face significant threats in reality, the paranoia stayed with him, and in the end it almost pretty much caused his death.
Yeah, rotting on his office floor, while people were too afraid to walk in.
Yeah, people were too afraid to go and do anything. Yeah.
So going back to how he managed to leverage this, what strikes you about the implements of the Russian state existing at the time, at the end of the Civil War in 24, and how that changes towards Stalin's death in 1953, and perhaps how it is now in Russia?
So, in terms of the state, I think it's almost as if everyone knew, or well, not everyone, but people were aware that Stalin had maybe taken it too far with the purges, and I think the fact that Khrushchev didn't obviously face an enormous amount of, not an enormous amount of physical backlash after the secret speech in 55, I think it was. I think that's evidence of the fact that people understood that while Stalin did what he did, and he was almost lauded for being, the great saviour after the war, I think people understood that the purges maybe were a step too far. And in terms of today, you could make links. Obviously, you can't say that Putin is carrying out Stalinist purges, but the fact that he attacks political enemies in a way that I think clearly demonstrates his own paranoia suggests that there is some evidence for the fact that there hasn't been that much of a change since those early sort of mid 20th century years of the Soviet Union.
So then, does the death of Alexei Navalny strike you as a bit of a outburst of paranoia? Then
you could definitely make that claim. I think there's definitely evidence for it. I think that Navalny obviously was a very significant person inside of Russia. I think his campaigns against the actions of Putin's government obviously ended up in him being assassinated, but I think his death definitely sort of was an example of Putin's paranoia, in that he was obviously afraid of what could happen if that person was allowed to carry on speaking, especially with the Ukraine war and how that's gone in recent years.
Do you think the Ukraine war as well is another outreach of that, almost a part of that paranoia, but in a way that it's some form of meeting up to almost a Stalinist, not in ideology per se, but in terms of that Russian aggressive ideology and foreign policy?
I think that's a great point of not saying that he's Stalinist. I think it's such an easy trap to fall into, of saying that Putin wants to be Stalin, but I don't think that's true. I think, if anything, he wants to be a great Russian leader, and maybe if that fits him into a similar circle as Joseph Stalin, then so be it. But I think, like you said, I think it fits more in to this idea of Russian expansionist rhetoric that he more taps into. I mean, when you listen to when he was talking, he had that interview with Tucker Carlson where he just spoke for hours about Russian history. If anything, that gave us a great indication of that, of showing us that it wasn't just talking about how great Stalin was, it was about the fact that in Russian history, this is the area that we've had. It's almost as if he wants to achieve that again. He wants to be, in a way, rather than a great, Soviet leader, he wants to be a great Russian Tsar again. It's almost like he wants to go back to those years.
So do you think that the propaganda in terms of on horseback with the Russian forestry and landscape, as well as living in palaces, which was exposed by Navalny in some of his YouTube content, do you think they are visual cues of where this man's personal ideology lies?
I think so. I think that it definitely, I think it would be unfair to him to call him a Soviet, or as if fit him more into the Soviet ideology. I think he definitely fits more into this sort of Tsarist Russian ideology instead, in that yes, he propagates this image of being the great man in the similar way to the Tsars did. He pushes the strength of the Russian Orthodox Church, and obviously people who are willing to question that are seen as a threat and dispatched. So I think it's very clear to see that he would, maybe not that he would like to be, but I think he's definitely, with his actions, should be put more towards the Tsars in a way than the Soviet leaders in terms of his actions.
So therefore, do you think he would be more comparable, let's say, to a more unfamiliar figure for most people of Russian history, which were Alexander Kolchak?
Yeah, I think that's definitely someone who he could be aligned with. Obviously, Kolchak was very much a military man. He was very much had less of an interest in the politics. I know that he's someone that you know a lot about and could probably speak about better than I could. He's definitely someone who was more interested in politics, I think, than any. Well, he was not interested in the politics and more interested in this sort of military style of action, which definitely could have linked him with Putin. I mean, what would you say in terms of the way that Putin is and the way that Kolchak was? Do you see the comparisons there? Is that something that you?
I honestly don't. I say it on the basis of personality, because Kolchak, for me, has always been a very, very cold and withdrawn character. So politics and foreplay in terms of, dealing with people on a diplomatic or personal level is very difficult for him. You can see it in the sources. You can see, people describe, I think it's General Graves, who was part of the, American expedition, described him as very, 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 distant or absent. Can't remember the word he used. But very, very, absent character. But still with that, I don't think that he realised that politics was almost like a benchmark. I don't think he completely realised that politics was a benchmark for securing one's own power rather than just the military side, which he was accustomed to. I think Putin knows these as both as tenets and both interdependent and can't survive without another.
So would you say that maybe that Putin is making up for the weaknesses that Kolchak, well, maybe not weaknesses, but is he someone who, that when Kolchak couldn't face up to the sort of the political side of being leader, that Putin can? Is that something that you believe with or agree with? Sorry.
Well, probably. I think Putin would rather we forget Kolchak. It's a common thing that you see about the Admiral's legacy, Admiral Kolchak's legacy in Russia. It's quite very ignominious, very buried under the carpet. He's historically conservative figure, was destroyed in reputation by the Soviet Union and a lot of their historians, as well as, culturally. I think the fact he doesn't have an unmarked grave, it happened at the time, and they did shoot him and his adjutant and push them into a gap in an icy cold river, and the bodies were never seen again. But places where have been commemorated in his honour, if you want to call it that, have been desecrated consistently by a numerous number of political factions in Russia. So I think that I drawing this comparison here, is very, very not in line with the kind of conservative, body ideology that Putin wants to push himself.
Right. Obviously, I think there's various links that we can make between people of today and the past, but you think there are links that you can make between the governments of today across the world? I mean, obviously, I think it would be unfair to say that the Russian government and the American government are similar, but with the actions of people like Elon Musk, are the actions of Elon Musk and people like that taking the American government closer, in a way, to the Russian government?
What are you alerting the sense of it's a little bit totalitarian in its tendency, or?
I think I think so. I think a concern of mine is that, in a way, it seems to me as if the American government wants to take a step away from democracy rather than towards it. In that they seem to believe in this, in the idea that Trump's this saviour that's going to make everything better, rather than actually accepting that sometimes things take time and you need things like democracy in order to make sure that positive change is brought about, rather than relying on one person instead. So yeah, that would be my concern with them. In terms of people like Elon Musk, I think that he is incredibly dangerous at this time. I think the way that he spreads misinformation, I think, is very dangerous. I think the way that he has such a massive amount of power when it comes to the media, I think is very, very dangerous for today's politics. Calling for the release of people like Tommy Robinson is a strange avenue to go down. But yeah, in terms of comparison between the Russian government and the American government, I think I think it's clear that while there are some similarities, I think that it's hard to sort of draw that line. But that's not to say that in a way, the oligarchy that's being created in the United States isn't a concern. Is definitely something that should be, thought about and worried about really around the world.
Well, on a base level, there's an oligarchy in Russia. I mean, culturally, that's been quite prevalent as well. I remember watching the Bourne movies when I was younger, and I think the main villain of the second one, the Bourne Supremacy, is this Russian oligarch who's obviously wants these called the Nevsky files, these CIA intelligence files for a murder of a Russian politician, an opposition Russian politician. So, and art can imitate life. Is often said by a lot of intelligence experts about the state of Russia and how he came to be was related to corruption and through this oligarchy in support of one power. I would then propose this question to you, which would be: would this necessarily resemble Russia in the past as being a very, very important structural, societal structure part of that system?
So is oligarchy a key part of that system?
Well, oligarchy, nepotism in any form?
Yes. So I think so. I think that it's very clear that while people like, I know we keep going back to him, but people like Stalin, obviously he had the cult personality. It was very clear that he was the one who was in control, and yet he still was in a way reliant on a lot of other people like Molotov, Beria, who were very close to him. I think that's, while it's difficult, you can't say that's nepotism. I think it's definitely relying on people who have significant power but are influencing them for a specific gain of their own. I think that's very clear, and it kind of shows that has been going on for a long time. Going back to the Tsars, it's hard to say no there, but at the same time, we're looking at a style of government that, in this country would be seen as medieval, of this of having a king and ruling from the top exclusively. It's something that's completely alien to us. And has been for a number of many hundreds of years. So, it'd be difficult to say that that's not derived and reliant on things like nepotism and things like that.
What do you think personally went through the heads of Molotov and perhaps other advisors? What do you think their mentality was when approaching someone as feared as Stalin, but also was powerful in that fear?
I mean, if you take people like Molotov and Beria, they are two very different people. Now, Beria was obviously someone who was out for his own personal gain. That's not to say that Molotov wasn't, but Beria was obviously just a horrendous human being, someone who, took delight in the sexual assault of others, and was,
Blimey.
was was an awful human being, and I think that he would have less fear than Molotov would. I think that Molotov was a very prideful man, and he probably would have not been very happy with us talking about him being afraid of talking to Joseph Stalin. But he still, I think, would have had at least the pride to be able to accept when that he may have been afraid of talking to Stalin at some points. And that would have been completely understandable. Obviously, he was a terrifying human being. But yeah, I think they were two very, very different people, and they acted in very different ways.
Was Molotov a very self-reflective person then?
I think you can make that argument. I think he was. I think he was someone who definitely was more affected by things than others were in the party at that time, in that inner circle. Obviously, Beria, I mean, as I said, was just someone who was, again, more concerned with him, I think, with his own gain and himself more so than anyone else. I think Molotov was definitely someone who was a political player, but he still had the awareness to be able to reflect on things, probably more so than others in that inner circle.
Would you say that's quite valuable in a general sense of life, like going across in the sense of, I can reflect on this, but when is realistically a question I've always been asking myself is like, when is actually the best time to reflect?
Well, I think that's a great question to ask yourself. But I think as long as you're able to have that kind of self-reflection, I think that's a really valuable skill to have. Now, it's easy to fall into take self-reflection and turn it into self-hatred in a way of constantly demeaning yourself. But I think as long as it takes a lot of understanding of yourself to be able to accurately self-reflect. It's something that I know we've spoken about a lot in the past, of being able to accurately reflect on your own actions. And it is something that takes a lot of work. But like I said, I think it is a challenge, but it is very, very important skill to master, I think.
Pretty solid, I suppose. I mean, one thing that's really struck me about Russian history as a whole is probably this pattern of, yes, we talked about it as a pattern of patronage, patronage, but also I'd say a pattern of bloodlust. One particular era topic you've covered is the Gulags, and actually being on quite the bloody end of the brutal hammer and sickle.
Yeah, they're a really interesting part. I mean, obviously, they were my dissertation, so I spent a lot of time looking at them and reading about them and researching them. So they are definitely, as you said, one of the bloodier parts and the most aggressive parts of that hammer and sickle. But they were also almost a sociological experiment in a way, or the way that you could look at them, you could see them as that. In that they took humans and they reduced them down to their barest means of survival, and that was pretty much it. And you did what you were told and you did your work. But I mean, one of the things that I came across was that guards could quite easily, if they made significant enough a mistake, could find themselves locked up in there, in the same way that prisoners could work themselves up into guards, and even further than that. The person one of the people who was heavily involved in the design of the White Sea Baltic Canal, Naftali Frankel, if I remember right, started off as a prisoner in a gulag and worked his way up to that position.
Oh, yeah.
They were I think one of the reasons why I looked into them is because I don't think they're talked about enough. And I mean, obviously, whenever I say, well, what do I do? What did you do for your dissertation? I mentioned gulags. The question I get next is, those things in COD, which if anything exemplifies why I did them in the first place, or why I researched them in the first place. They're a dark part of history that has not, in my view, been researched enough. They were they were incredibly interesting for me. I mean, I'd drawn into the sort of darker parts of history anyway, but looking at those was very interesting. I mean, if you there was one story that I'll never forget about a university student. I mean, obviously I was doing this as a university student, so I instantly was sort of tied to it. But there was a story of a university student called Dugayev, who was unfortunately one of the people who was picked up in Stalin's quotas of you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, you got picked up and you were sent to a gulag. And obviously he'd never ever done any kind of physical labour in his life, and all of a sudden he was in where was he? Kolyma, that was it, in right in the east of Siberia. I think it was a mine of some kind, and he got told he had to do I think it was like about a couple of feet square of the rubble that he had to break out. I think he said he worked himself pretty much to the bone, blisters all over his hand, killed himself pretty much getting it. I think he got about 3/4 of the way done, but that wasn't enough. And that night they took him out and they shot him because he wasn't working hard enough. And I think that really stuck with me, purely because, like I said, it was reducing them down. Not only as a prisoner living there was about survival, but it reduced the prisoners down to just being cattle in a way of, well, they're not doing enough. He's probably never going to get any better than that.
Active demeaning, yeah.
He's going to be gone. There's stories all the time. Wherever you read, you'll read stories about how the dead and the dying would have their clothes stolen pretty much immediately. They'd play the guards would play card games over trucks of women that were coming in. They were, so there was something of, I mean, I really enjoyed researching them, but there was something that doesn't get looked into enough, should be looked into further, and they're incredibly interesting, for not only just for looking into what it was to be Russian, but also looking into just sort of humanity as a whole.
When you say, gulags have now become a bit of a colloquialism, if we want to compare a really bad, let's student accommodation, for example. If you said, I've got cheap student accommodation, it's like a ghetto, it's like a gulag, ghetto, another word of the 20th century, well, throughout history, but 20th century is most prominent for the connotations of that. Do you think we in some way devalue those words by using them for relative hardships here, but still, in a modern Western world, which still has a very, very flourishing economy to some extent, and we use them for those scenarios? Do you think that's pretty just?
Well, I think that in a lot of cases like that, I think people get worried about devaluing terms and devaluing what's going on, but you can't devalue something if it's properly understood. We've spent a lot of time talking about the power of education and how education is vital to stop ideologies that shouldn't be spread from spreading. And I think that you only devalue those things by not understanding them. Like you can compare your student accommodation to the gulag, but you know exactly how bad they were. You know about what it was like in there.
I'm not actually comparing my student accommodation to the gulag. It's quite nice, but
yeah. But no, again, I think it's I think people almost get frightened of things from the past that you can't talk about, when it's like, well, if you don't talk about them, it's so much easier for them to be, well, not only forgotten, but for them to be devalued anyway. I think I mean, one thing that hopefully will never be devalued or shouldn't be devalued is things like the Holocaust, which, I mean, we've spoken about the word genocide and how that's overused a lot of the time, but the fact that there won't be a child in this country that won't know what the Holocaust is, or won't have learnt about it from a very young age,
or any genocide for that matter.
Exactly, it's something. I think that's one of the things that we do right. It's not, but it's not just about what happened. It's understanding why it happened, and by doing that, even we understand that things like Holocaust and words like genocide shouldn't be thrown around, because then it would be devalued. But I think it is. Yeah, I think education is massively important in making sure that things don't get important in historical events don't get devalued.
I'd say that also in regards to that last point about throwing words around, that's kind of what I was going on to in terms of throwing around gulag and stuff like that, but what do you think about the redefinition of terms? So, when we take something from a previous era, I mean, an example off the top of my head, I was reading Dickens' A Christmas Carol one night or whatever, and, the word gay came up. Gay meant happy.
Yeah.
You could argue some people still think it's happy. Some people who have homophobic traits, it's not a happy thing. But it's become to define, people who are homosexual and homophobia to some extent when people have been towards that. But my point of view would be, how do you feel about some definitions? That was probably a really bad example I gave, but
it was all right.
But how do you think about the redefinition of terms over time?
So, again, that's something that I think is talked about a lot today. Of terms things that you can and can't say. I think that I think it comes down to the context that is used, and also the respect of the individual that's using them. Like I wouldn't ever go around and as flippantly throw out the word gay and accuse someone of being gay for certain things or anything like that. Because I understand how that's been used in the past, and I understand how it's been used to devalue people in the past and obviously make them feel less than they actually are. And I think it does come down to the word itself in a way. I think there are words that you shouldn't throw around at all, and there are words that maybe we've taken too far. But yeah, either way, I think again it comes down to context. It comes down to respect of the group that are usually targeted by that word. And yeah, I think context and respect are probably the key sort of things that go behind sort of redefining words.
In that respect, then, what role does the individual play in that? What psychological role do they play in that?
Well, I think in terms of the role of the individual, again, obviously, when you take the individual, that are being targeted by those words, for example, using words that like gay, for example, well, I'm trying to think of anything else.
Just any derogatory term.
Don't
list them, obviously.
That's the thing. I'm trying not to say them. Okay, but yeah, it's taking those terms, and if you take the individual out, in a way, it does sort of depower those words. But you can't take the individual out, and you've got to understand that to some individuals it will mean more than it does to others. In the same way that I mean. But then it's not just derogatory terms; it's pretty much anything. Like it depends on the individual. Like, I mean, with gay and stuff. I mean, you see lots of sort of derogatory terms that are used in pop music, but they're comfortable with using it as the individual. I think the individual is very important, and it comes down to respect and context, and it's the respect for the individual that you're talking to. I think that's very important.
Going back to the Soviet Union again, and the use of those and those terms as well. Because we've just discussed that they can be identifiers for certain groups with certain contexts. Do you think that those terms have played a very, very important role in Russian history as a whole? Not just the Soviet Union, in fact, implemented at any state Russian level.
I think so. I think that they do hold a lot of power in Russian society, and in the Russian state. I mean, what kind of words do you think would hold the most power to you, do you think? Or what do you think holds the most power to you?
Well, what comes to mind is probably the era of repression during the Russian Civil War of 17 to 23, 24.
Right.
A specific example would be the Gulags, which were a higher present minority. And we can use other examples as well, like for instance, Volga Germans. But terms that deviate, a group as different from the other, particularly at a time like the Russian Civil War of bloodshed, poverty, with the famine and so forth, and it really strikes me when you look on those periods and you think, there's a lot of bad humanity that does come out because of that, and there's a lot of reason. I mean, I remember listening to Bertrand Russell. He gave like a phenomenal like talk once, and he said, you know, on his meeting with Vladimir Lenin in, I think, 1920, he said, you know, how almost jubilant Lenin was, the fact he'd managed to find something on the basis of class to turn the peasants against one another in a way that he could manipulate the situation. And Russell describes how Lenin was like roaring with laughter, that they would just string them up to the nearest tree and hang the Gulags.
Yeah, that obviously, that would in a way give a reason for why maybe the idea of kulaks would be something that's a bit more protected in Russia. You know, the idea of being jubilant, of being able to kill your fellow Russian, that would obviously be. I mean, you can imagine that would be something that would be, you know, sort of a difficult term to talk about in Russian society, in Russian states. I mean, if you look at the Soviets, obviously there was almost as if they went group by group. Obviously, the army in the 1930s were a great concern to Stalin. What we said earlier, the doctors and the so-called Jewish doctors at the end were a worry for him, that he thought were out to get him. You know, I mean, you could maybe say that it's difficult to tie it down to one term in Russia because there've been so many groups that have been targeted. Maybe that would be a claim that you could make.
Do you think that this is kind of worse in the sense that it's worse when it's being done by individuals that are coercing others, or is it worse in the sense of there are people with, I'm thinking morally on this, and we are very, very difficult to put moral judgments on history, but certainly when we're going to learn things, is it worse when you have all of the individuals that all believe in it?
Yes, but how often could you say that all of the individuals would have believed in what the communists wanted, or, I mean, in what Stalin wanted? So I think that would be probably my viewpoint on that.
Well, like hard to assess sources wise.
Yeah, in a way. I think it's, yeah, that would be probably my viewpoint on it. Yeah.
Thanks very much for that. If you really enjoyed that, there's some more content down here, but don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.